Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another program on Software Engineering 1 course. In the previous program, we discussed the requirements engineering process. We described different activities of the process. One of the important activity was the requirements analysis. During this activity, we get the user requirements. The analyst tries to understand what are the real requirements of the customer. This itself is a very elaborate process, that what are the methods and techniques which can be used to collect the user requirements. This is the topic of our today's program. In today's program, we will explain requirements analysis process, and we'll discuss different requirements elicitation techniques. Dear students, software analysis is an important process. The capability of the system after it has been developed and delivered depends on how well it meets the customer needs and supports the work to be automated. If the analyst does not correctly discover the customer's real requirements, the delivered system is unlikely to meet the customer's expectation. Many studies have shown that many projects fail only because the requirement analysis has been carried out poorly. Therefore, one has to be very careful in doing the requirements analysis. Requirement analysis generally involves a number of different people in an organization. These include system end users, managers, system developers, and many other people. Ideally, everyone who may have some direct or indirect influence on the system must be involved in this process. That's what we call the stakeholders. So it is the job of the system analyst to make sure that all the stakeholders have been involved in this process so that their requirements can be known and can be implemented in the final product. The process that is used to discover requirement is very much depends on the problem domain. In different problem domains, you might find different techniques more suitable. However, the process model illustrating all the important activities is shown in this figure. The major activities of requirement analysis process are domain understanding, requirements validation, requirements definition and specification, requirements collection, requirements classification, conflict resolution, and prioritization of the requirements. Note one important point here, that these activities are highly interactive and they provide the feedback to each other. For example, when you are performing the domain understanding activity, you might have to go back to the requirement collection, or the requirement collection can improve your domain understanding. Similarly, all other activities provide a feedback to the other activities to improve the understanding of the problem and to discover the true requirements of the system we are developing. Let's see what we really do during each of these activities of the analysis phase. In domain understanding, analysts must develop the understanding of the application domain. Understanding just the system you are going to develop is not enough. An analyst must have a broader view of the domain itself. For example, if you are going to develop a system for a supermarket, then you should find out how the supermarkets operate generally. So having a good understanding of the domain will improve your understanding the overall system you are going to develop. The requirements collection activity. During requirement collection activity, the analyst interacts with the stakeholders to discover their true requirements. Now there is a confusion there. Most of the students think that it is they who have to write the requirements themselves. They have to define all the requirements. This is not the case. We develop the system for customers. The system should satisfy the requirement of the stakeholders. Our job is to know what really they want and put them in a formal way. So we have to interact with the customers. We have to interact with all the stakeholders which will be using that system and ask them what really they want to see that software performing for them. Of course, there are different methods that can be used to collect user requirements, and we'll be discussing those methods shortly. In the classification activity, once we have collected the requirements, then we have to classify the requirement. We should organize them into set of related clusters. That's a very useful activity. If you just write the requirements one by one, and a requirement comes here and the related requirement has been written after 10 pages on that requirement, on the requirement document, you might miss some of the requirements. It's very important that once you collect all the requirements, then the requirements which are logically related to each other should be written at the same place in your document. Once you have classified the requirements, then another important activity has to be performed, what we call the conflicts resolution. We discussed that thing before, that once you are interacting with the stakeholders and getting their requirements, then you might have the requirements which are conflicting with each other. Therefore, it is the task of the analyst to make sure that if there are conflicts in the requirements, or if there are the conflicts in the views in which the stakeholder are looking at the system, then they should be resolved. You have to develop the techniques and methods to resolve the conflicts. You might have to meet the stakeholders, discuss with them, so that all the conflicts in the requirements can be removed. After removing the conflicts, another important activity is prioritization of the requirements. During the requirement analysis phase, you might collect hundreds of user requirements. As a developer and designer, it's your responsibility to find out which requirements have the higher priority so that they should be implemented. Remember, we always have the constraints. We have the budget constraints, we have the time constraints. Therefore, to implement the most important requirements of the customer, we need to know that which requirements have higher priority so that they can be implemented in the earlier version, or they should be implemented early. The requirements which have the low priority, they might not be implemented because of the resources. So a clear prioritization of the requirement is an important thing to do. Once we have done that thing, then another activity is the requirements validation. During the requirement validation, the requirements are checked to discover if they are complete, consistent, and in accordance with what stakeholder really wants from the system. In the previous program, we already discussed the requirements validation in much more detail. Note that the activities shown in this diagram are highly iterative as I said before. They provide the feedback to each other. Once you are doing the classification, you might find out that some of the requirements are missing, and then you have to go back to the requirements collection phase. Once you are doing the requirement collection, it is possible that at the same time, whatever requirement you collect, you put the requirement in the right category. Once you are collecting the requirements, that can improve the understanding of the domain. As you get more familiar with the domain, you can come up with more requirements. So that is very important. There is no final activity and there is no real start activities. These activities are generally carried out in parallel. Now, the process can be viewed as a cycle, of course, starting with domain understanding and then ending with having the requirement validation and ultimately preparing a requirements document which elaborates all the requirements in detail. Now, let's see what techniques are available to requirement elicitation, the requirement gathering. You cannot write the requirements of a user unless you gather them. The question is, how can we get the requirements from the user? There are many techniques which can be used. The most important and most commonly used techniques are asking. Ask the customer. And generally asking means doing the interviews, questionnaires, and the group discussions. Asking is the most commonly used technique in getting the user requirements. In the interviews, the analyst meets with the stakeholders and asks them what really they want. So there is a interaction, a direct interaction with the stakeholders. Doing the interview is an art. The analyst has to prepare interview very carefully. He should know before the interview starts that who is going to interview, what he will be asking, and once the interview is finished, what he will be getting out of it. If the interviews are not planned well, and if the analyst is not sure about what information he really wants from that interview, it's just a wastage of time. Therefore, be very careful and well prepared when you are going to do the interviews. Clearly identify which person should be interviewed. You cannot interview everybody. In the big organization, the organization which are geographically scattered, you cannot go and meet everybody personally. But we know that we have to get the requirement from all the stakeholders. So when that limitation is there, that the number of stakeholders are too many and you cannot meet with each of them, the questionnaire is a very commonly used technique then. In the questionnaire, you prepare a set of questions and then you mail those questionnaires to all the concerned stakeholders and get their requirements. Preparing the questionnaires and then analyzing the questionnaires is also a very important task there. You should know how a questionnaire should be designed properly and what type of questions can be there in a questionnaire. Generally, we say either you are doing the interviews or you are preparing the questionnaires. There are two types of questions which are generally asked. What we call the open-ended questions and the closed-ended questions. In the closed-ended questions, you ask a question and generally provide the possible answers and ask the person to take one or more of them from the list. In the open-ended questions, generally you write the question and don't lead the respondent to a particular answer. Let him speak his mind. So both of these type of questions are very important and they can provide you a real insight into the system. Brainstorming is again another very, very important way of gathering the requirements. I will discuss one of such technique which uses the brainstorming to come up with a set of requirements. The second technique which can be used to gather the requirements is task analysis. See what's happening in the organization, what really they are doing, and how they do it. Use your common sense to analyze different tasks which are performed in that organization or different tasks which your software should be performing. Remember, you are automating a system. System is already there in most of the cases. Your job is to see how it really operates, how really it works. So a computer system can really reflect the working of a real system. Another technique which is used is ethnography. Study the people in their natural setting. In the ethnography, the analyst generally sits with the customer, with the user in their working environment, observes them how they work. Of course, the analyst has two options there. Either he can sit in a corner and see how different people work, what do they do, and how they do different activities. Or he can become himself a part of the system, an apprentice, and work with them. Of course, both of these approaches have their drawbacks and strengths. If you are watching a person from a corner, the people might become conscious, and they might not do the thing in the manner they generally do in their daily business life. If you become an apprentice, then they might not cooperate with you too much. Generally, combine both of these techniques. Observation is important, and also becoming a part of the system can also help you to understand the system in a much better way. Another technique which can be used to gather the information is form analysis. All the organizations, they have the forms. They have the written material there. They have the register in the notebooks. Analyze them. Analysis of those documents and the forms will tell you that what type of information is really stored, used, who uses that information, and how that information is really produced and ultimately used, and the way this information flows from one point in the organization to another point in that organization. Of course, forms provide information about only the data domain. What type of processing is carried out there, you might not be able to really see that thing in the forms. Another technique which can be used is natural language descriptions. Generally, the operating instructions in writing, where the natural language is used to lay out the procedures which are used in that organization to carry out different activities. If you are looking at a procedure, how the salary of an employee is calculated, of course, they must be having a complete description of it. So reading the description, the manuals, and the operating procedures will help you to understand how the things are happening in that organization. But don't forget, natural languages are ambiguous. They say something, you take one meaning, and that thing might have a different meaning there. Therefore, you have to discuss whatever you read with the people who are really using that document to find out the true meaning of whatever is written there. And don't forget, the descriptions which are written there are not often kept up to date. Something is published a couple of years before, and the people have been still using the same document. And there might have been a lot of amendments that have been made and not reflected in the document. So you have to see what updates have been made in that document. Those updates might have been somewhere else. So you have to ask the customers, you have to ask whoever is using that document, that whether some changes have been made in that document or not. Another technique to gather the system requirement is derivation from an existing system. You can drive the requirements of the system you are going to build if a similar system already exists. Of course, that system can help you a lot to know what really this type of system should be working. That doesn't mean that all the requirements can be collected from looking at one old system, but of course, it's a great help. You can also look at some other related system working as a domain analysis. And you can also identify the reusable components, the concept, the structures of that old system. And you might find it very helpful in defining, designing, and developing your own system. But don't have the tunnel vision. That means don't stick to whatever you see there. You should have your own imagination. You should come up with something new. Remember, if the old system was enough, or a similar system was enough for that organization, they might have gone to purchase that. If they have contacted you, they want something better. So use the old system just as a guideline for you. And another important technique to gather requirement is prototyping. Prototyping generally starts with a set of initial requirements. You construct a working system very quickly on an experimental basis. You show it to the end users and get their feedback. Generally, prototyping of the gray areas of the system is very useful to know the real requirement of the user. Of course, there are many other techniques which can be used to collect the required information. But remember, there is no good or a bad technique here. In most of the cases, analyst has to use more than one technique to discover system requirements. Generally, we combine the interviews with the questionnaires, with document observation, and other techniques together. And all these techniques, when used together, will give you the real picture of the system. However, some techniques have been more successful and more strong than others under certain circumstances. For example, interviews, form analysis, task analysis, domain analysis are very strong techniques in understanding the working of the present system and knowing the current requirement of the system. Whereas brainstorming and prototyping are very strong on identifying the future requirement of a system. Dear students, in today's program, we explain the requirements analysis process, and we discuss different activities which are carried out during this phase. We discussed that requirement analysis process is a highly interactive activity with a lot of feedback going from one activity to the other activity. We also discussed different requirement elicitation techniques which can be used to gather the system requirements. Dear students, in the next lecture, we'll discuss some of the specific techniques which are used to gather the requirements in the organizational settings. Till then, Allah Hafiz.